You're listening to the Flex Success podcast, where we teach you how to be less shit.
I'm your co-host Lizzy, and this is Dean. We'll be covering all topics relating to health, fitness, and bodybuilding.
Join us as we use our in the trenches experience and up-to-date science to provide you with information that you can actually use.
If you like what we do, be sure to give us a like, follow, share, and tag us on social media. We are pumped for this episode today, everyone. I'm here with Flex Coach George and Flex Coach Dean. Hi, boys.
What's good?
Yo.
And we are bringing you an episode on the 3 different peak week strategies. The reason we decided to do this, carb loading peak week strategies specifically, and we decided to record an episode on it because we do at least 3 posts a week on the Flex Instagram wall, and Dean did a post about the 3 different carb loading strategies that you could use in a peak week, and it went off. People had loads of questions, were really interested in it. So you obviously want to know more. So here we are telling you more. I am going to be here just to moderate, to stop Dean if he waffles, to tell fart jokes. But this is going to be on George and Dean because I'm not a prep coach and the 2 boys are. And then we're going to talk about 3 different strategies for carb loading in peak weeks, maybe beginning with the definition from George on what on earth is a peak week.
Peak week is essentially an opportunity for physique athletes or anyone competing in a stage or performance, so it'd be female category, male category, to maximize the cherry on the cake, essentially, right? We're thinking about the last kind of 1%, final touches on the physique. Once all the hard work is done, body fat's low, conditions in, fatigue's managed, what can we do now from an input perspective to change those last few percent of cosmetic changes that are going to maybe differentiate between placings and, like I said, finish off the look there?
Okay. Dean, would you add anything to that? Or
No, I think it's just the culmination of many weeks of dieting that is wrapped in a little bow just to, I suppose, finish off the look.
okay.
That is the important final line. It's the finishing off of the look. It's not the creation of necessarily a new look, which I think a lot of people think can happen in a peak week. I'll asterisk that and say, with some people's drug use, you can certainly get significant changes depending on what you do. But for 99% of people, we're talking about just dialing up the look a small margin. So,
and how important do you think a peak week is for that cherry on top, for wrapping the person in a bow? Like, let's say somebody's like, you know what, I don't really know how to do a peak week. I think I'm just going to cruise in, do what I've always been doing. What might the differences be in the end result in a physique athlete who did that versus doing an actual peak week under the guidance of the coach that knows what they're doing?
I think it depends on the nuance a little bit there. With if the individual is just in a good position of body fat and they don't necessarily look like they need to peak and don't know how to, if they just ran in consistent as they were, it's a very safe bet that they're going to look very consistent to where they do with that representation in time. So they know what their stage package is going to be. And if it's in condition enough, well. Could a peak enhance the physique? Yes, I think it can, but there's also the opportunity there that by playing and moving too many variables that you can lose track of it, lose the look, and then not know how to fix the problem.
I think if I was to categorize this into 2 people, usually when you get to a peak, you're going to have somebody who looks pretty damn good already and is relatively well managed in the stress. Those individuals could just flow through that week and not really see a tremendous benefit in manipulating a hell of a lot of things from a positive improvement. There is a potential that they could make it look worse if they get too caught up in like trying to find this like optimal look. So like if you're already in a good spot, like George said at the beginning, then you can probably just roll on through. But there certainly are individuals that get to the beginning of a peak week, like 7 days out, 10 days out, that are very, very beaten up because you've had to push them very hard to achieve the condition. And they don't necessarily look fantastic, they don't look how you want them to look, then a peak week could actually like drastically change that. So you can drastically remove a negative look, but it won't drastically improve an already positive look, is probably what I would say.
Okay.
Yeah,
fair. Okay, cool. And so I've mentioned a couple of times now that what we're talking about specifically today is how to the 3 different strategies of manipulating carbohydrates in a peak week. But just so everybody's familiar with the variables, what are, just briefly summarizing them, what are the other variables that could be manipulated in a peak week?
So macronutrients, Macronutrients like protein, carbs, and fats, your micronutrient
Okay.
intake, more specifically your electrolyte intake, fluid, training variables, potential PED implements if the individual's enhanced, generally covers the basics.
Yep.
Okay. Cool. Great. And hopefully one of the variables we aren't changing is sleep, because we know that leading into comp. What sleep?
I don't know. I usually get a bit of an improvement on peak week. Typically, I find once the carb start going in, the stress starts to shift and change, and sleep patterns get better.
Yeah.
Nice.
Let me quickly caveat this and say, anyone that's entering a peak week, if you can find an opportunity to think of it as like I made it week, and a relaxation week, and a week that can be exciting, like finally all the hard work, now I get to present, then that in itself will make probably the biggest impact on your physique from a positive perspective. If you get to peak week and you want to make it super stressful by trying to play with lots of different dials, or you're worried about the look and all the rest of it, then your sleep's going to go to shit, like your digestion may go to shit, you're going to question, it's going to make it really, really bad. So the best thing that you could possibly do in the peak week is just try not to think too much and just enjoy the ride. Like it's like, fuck, man, you've just dieted really fucking hard for 20 weeks, 25 weeks, maybe 12 weeks. I don't know. Like, take this 1 week as an opportunity just to enjoy the work you've done. Give yourself a pat on the back and say, nothing much can happen here from a fat loss perspective, but a shitload can happen from a stress perspective. So do absolutely everything you can to manage stress in the most positive manner.
And I suppose it's one of the benefits of having a good coach, because you are able to trust and just go through the process that your coach has been mulling over, kind of pouring themselves over all of the numbers. They take the stress for you.
Well, this is the other thing too, right? It's the coach is selfishly wants you to win, of course, because it's good for them as it is good for you. So every decision they're going to make that week is done in a manner, I would hope, that they're trying to facilitate the best possible result. So you should literally be like, fuck yeah, man, he's got me, or she's got my back, like whatever it is. It shouldn't be like, oh, I don't think they've got this right, or what if they haven't fed me too much? What if they've fed me too much? Like, the more you start to second guess the process, the worse it gets.
Yeah, 100%.
Okay. And so now let's start with defining what the 3 different peak week carb loading strategies are. Maybe we'll go one for one, starting with Dean.
Just to quickly touch on this, there's obviously more than 3 strategies. We're just going to be talking about the 3 strategies that are most, or the easiest ones to manipulate, because carbohydrates are the macronutrient of choice that will give you the greatest look with the least amount of risk for any negatives. So we're just mainly just going to touch on those. First strategy, as the name suggests, it's called a front load. And by being a front load, what we mean by that is we're just essentially loading the dominant amount of carbohydrates, or the most amount of carbohydrates for the week on a per day basis at the front end of the week. So if we were just to call peak week for this instance a 7-day period, we'd be probably loading the largest quantity of carbohydrates on day 1, day 2, maybe day 3 at the front end of the week. And then we'd be tapering those carbohydrates down towards the back end of the week, i.e. a front load.
Okay. And so later we're going to talk about like why we might do that versus a different strategy. But for now, let's just get through them and what they are. George, do you want to talk us through the second one?
So the second one is a really simple, easy thing to get your head around after listening to the Dean. Essentially, just flip it the back way around. So the backload approach is exactly that. It is similar to the front load, except you just move the carbohydrates to the back end of the week, closer to your competition day, and we'll be planning to fill your glycogen up higher at that back end point for the look on stage.
Okay. And number 3, Dean.
3, undulating load, which is a mishmash of 2. There's going to be days where you may be high in carbohydrates. There'll be days where you may be like moderate or low, but it's going to be almost like a wave-like fashion traditionally. We might start with, a moderate amount of carbohydrates and taper them up until there's a particular look achieved. We may then pull them back down to see what happens to the look again, taper them back up, and you may end up with carbohydrates like high at the front and high at the end, or you might have them high in the middle and then low at the end. Point is that it's going to undulate. It's going to go up and down, up and down, up and down until you hit the desired look that you're after.
Okay. And now there are pros and cons, and risks and rewards to choosing one strategy or the other. And we will see if there's time to touch on that. But first, tell me, boys, Dean or George, I'll just throw it out to both of you. How might somebody choose if they want to do a front load, a back load, or an undulating carbohydrate load?
I wouldn't recommend anyone tries to take on an undulating load themselves, because trying to look at yourself and be able to critically pick that apart sounds like my idea of, putting you in a mental ward. That would drive me insane. Not like the emotional waves, the way you perceive yourself, not be accurate for that. That should only be done with the coach in the corner, guiding you through it and looking unemotionally at imagery, data, etc. So the reason, or the way, sorry, you would ideally figure out which approach or method suited you best would essentially come from during the prep at periods of times where you would take a refeed opportunity. So whether that was you guiding yourself or a coach telling you to take a refeed, you look at what the response is within your visuals, both from fluid, fullness, how the total package looks the day of, the day after, a couple of days after, and you keep tracking it and you look and see how the body responds. You might find that your best look across that refeed actually seems to see most improvement one day after the refeed, in which case might lean you more toward a backloading approach, seeing that loading carbs right there the next day seem to be the best approach. Or you might find that you refeed, pull in a bit of fluid, and then 4 to 5 days later, you have a really crisp, but still holding on to quite a lot of fullness. So you take the refeed data and the assessment of the visuals and changes to then decide which way you should start to lean toward. That doesn't mean you're 100% going to go for it, but it gives you the first idea to create the initial trial, essentially.
Yeah, here. I would say, like, if you have been refeeding and you know what you look like the day after or the day after 2 or 3 days after, then you more than likely go the backload if you like the look. But if you've never really taken much stock or paid much attention to the look throughout refeed data, or you don't have any refeed data throughout the prep, then you'd probably be best suited to go for the front load because it's the safest. You can load carbohydrates and make the look a little bit smoother or sloppy or whatever you want to call it, and then you can fix that throughout peak week. But if you do it as a backload and Hail Mary it and just go, you know what, it's time to load, and you wake up the morning of the show and there's some shit that's gone wrong, well, you've got very limited time to fix that. So safe bet front load. Also a safe bet backload, but only if you have previous data, like George said.
And the prime example of that one I've got live in the flesh of Ethan currently. So he come on board at 12 weeks out, and with the time frame to make condition, we didn't have time to trial peak. So the way that I ran his first peak was essentially to take the data, err on the side of caution, front load earlier in the week, and taper off toward the end. That of just so people gather how the coach would then respond to that. We then look at that as, okay, right, you come in a little bit flat into comp. Now I know that's the response I need to change and tweak for the next process.
Sex differences by any chance? I'm not sure. It's not something that I do a lot of these days. I used to primarily front load females because it was just my preference to do that because of the fluid shifts. But
again, similar to that, I think it's not just female specific. If we go down to like the gender bias there, the only real kind of topic of conversation there would be that maybe females have a slightly higher tolerance to need for intramuscular triglycerides, but that difference is more or less negligible, right? You're going to cover that with even the smallest of fat loads. So the main real difference here is class criteria, and obviously bikini, you're not going to want to come in bursting full loads of vascularity, so a front load typically suits best. But then wellness is also kind of similar because we don't really want vascularity and fullness. So again, front load seems to be more appropriate. Person dependent, I will caveat, because some people seem to shift quite rapidly within a 24-36 hour window. But then when you move up to, let's say, figure or perhaps some of the bigger, more muscular classes where they are required to have more condition and come in with a drier, more peeled look, makes a bit more sense to perhaps play around with their look and potentially consider the fullness aspect needing a bit of a later carb push. It doesn't mean a front load might not be appropriate for the individual, but it typically, I'd say, is more class specific than like a male female bias.
Yeah, cool.
Good point. All right, so let's say somebody now understands the three main different carb loads for peak weeks, like which strategy might be right for them based on our quick discussion. How might they figure out the amount of carbohydrates they want to front load with, back load with, or undulate?
So if you have refeed data and you're going to go for the front load or the back load, technically you could just rinse repeat whatever you've done before. It has been my experience, though, that you can typically get away with somewhere in the vicinity of usually like a 1 to 1.5 times your normal refeed across both of those across that day if you're going to go the back load, and you'll still probably be pretty good. And I say that for the following reasons. Most of the time when you're refeeding throughout prep, you're doing it for the purpose of refueling glycogen for energy availability so that you can train a little bit better, but also just to pull down a little bit stress. a little bit of stress, but it's typically not like a full-blown like attempt to refuel glycogen, because you're also still trying to achieve fat loss. Whereas towards the back end of the prep, when you hit the peak week, you're the most depleted you technically should have been. So your available stores you start with are lower than what they have been throughout the dieting process as well, and you're generally a little bit more sensitive to carbohydrate use. So you can generally get away with a little bit more. But the amount you would choose would be roughly essentially your peak, not your peak week, your refeed data. Like if that's good, then just roll with it. If you're completely unaware, good luck for one. But that's when we can maybe lean on some glycogen restoration data that we see in endurance athletes. But the caveat here is that those athletes are only trying to refuel glycogen to the maximum capacity for the purpose of fuel availability. They've got zero consideration for how that impacts the cosmetic look. So even though we can say that, and also when I give you these numbers in a second, you'll see how varied they are. Even though we can say that X amount of grams of carbohydrates per kilogram of body weight should refuel glycogen stores maximally, and then technically a full glycogen store should be a very full muscle, it doesn't necessarily mean it'll be the best look. So those numbers are like anywhere in the vicinity of about 8 grams per kilogram up to about 15 grams per kilogram in the research. So like there's literally 100% difference. And then not only is there a big difference in the amount per kilogram, but also in the repetition of refeeding required. And that is anywhere between 1 to 3 days of refeeding in order to restore glycogen. So if you quickly look at this, you may have one individual that refuels fully at 8 grams per kilogram for 1 day. You may have another individual that takes 15 grams per kilogram for 3 days repeated. Huge differences.
Just to give listeners an idea of what this might look like, if you've got a 100 kilogram person, that's what, 800 grams of carbs, up to 1,500 grams of carbs. Yep. And if the person eating 800 grams of carbs is only doing that for 1 day, it's 800 grams of carbs. If the person needs, what did you say, 16 grams, 15?
5 kilos of carbs.
Right, okay. So it's shitloads more, I think, is the actual specific number. The scientific term, shitloads more. Mm-hmm.
I would say,
I just have a quick question there, Dean.
Yeah, I was going to say visually, I've never really had anyone that I can, off the top of my head, that I've done 3 days of repeat 15 times body weight. I may have, to be honest, but it's not as common. So it's going to be somewhere towards the mid range of that for most individuals.
Probably Michael Lucy, the big motherfucker.
You'd be surprised. I've had some interesting cases where not mass, definitely look good from a muscularity standpoint, but they're not the largest in stature and size, and they take a heap of food to load them. Yeah, I found somewhere between over the course of say like a 3-day window, somewhere between like 15 to 30 gram per kilogram seems to be about appropriate for most people. Again, it very much depends on like how depleted you're coming into the peak week though, because if you're running and chasing your tail, well, you probably won't be in a position to load maximally anyway, but you're going to have a greater perpetuation of empty tank to then fill. Whereas if you're coming into it in a more relaxed, calm state, you'll find that you won't actually need quite a lot to tip you back over the edge. And that can also differ prep to prep, depending on how you come into the peak week.
Yeah.
I also, like George just touched on this then, I think this is one of the biggest factors is that individuals that are a little bit hyped and a little bit stressed and a little bit like over the top with their thoughts and their actions, they almost often need more food, but it's because they just burn through fuel. So like the more relaxed you can come into a peak week, like I said, and just be excited by it, actually the less food you need. And as fun as it sounds to say, everyone wants to I'll be the guy, I'll talk on behalf of men here. Everyone wants to be the guy that says, I loaded 1,500 grams of carbs. Like it's kind of like saying that you bench pressed up 200 kilos a week out. Like no one gives a fuck how many you actually ate. Like it's cool and it looks great on paper, but like, what does it look like, And then the consideration of class specific too, George, you mentioned with the women before, and that is like, if you're a classic competitor and you have to make weight, do you really want to have to then load 2,000 grams of carbs in the space of 12 to 24 hours to look good in order to then get on stage and have a bloated belly? Probably not, man. So the goal should always be is to, what is the least amount that I can have that will give me the best possible look without pushing the limits on everything to the point where we may run into some bottlenecks, whether that's being digestion or, impacting sleep. A year of guys having to get up in the middle of the night to get carbohydrates in, like that's probably not going to be the most conducive way to get carbohydrate loaded, you know?
Yeah. I think the point you made there about the sort of like the environment of the individual being more aroused neurologically and expending energy. I think you see that quite a lot with first timers coming in. They do their first show and it's crazy trying to keep them full. And then they do the second show a week later or the week after that. And where they're more familiar and habitualized with what is expected of them, how the day runs, nerves are down, all of a sudden, very different peak week in a very short time frame.
Yeah, massively.
Interesting. So you guys mean because the person who's a little bit more anxious, they're physically more agitated and they're like just their NEAT is up? Is that
Move
what we're
more,
saying?
Yep.
Fidget more, think more, stress more.
Okay, fine. Okay. I'm actually quite impressed about how succinctly we've been running through our subtopics. And initially I thought maybe we'd have to do a part 1 and part 2, but I think we're doing really well. Do you guys want to touch on, famous last words, touch on the pros and cons of a front load, then a back load, then an undulating carb load in a peak week?
Yeah.
Do you guys want to save that for a part 2, or do you think we can get through this in some sort of timely fashion?
I think it's good.
And then maybe some quick
All right.
considerations each one. So we'll just roll the same order and I'll go load first.
Sure thing. Yep. Front load, pros and cons.
I mean, the biggest pro for me here is safety. Safety is probably not safety. It's a safe approach to ensuring that you have a pretty good look without likely getting a bad look. Unless you want
Keep
to
going. I'll be back in a sec.
That one bad look could be a flat look in that you've become glycogen depleted throughout the week. But I think that just takes some careful consideration for the front load. So if you are going to front load, one of the things you have to actually be consciously aware of is that exercise burns fuel. And if you're going to load fuel at the front of the week, it's probably counterproductive to then burn through fuel throughout the week. So like we had a comment on the post of one girl who noticed that when they did the front load first, which was probably a fantastic choice for the first peak week that they did with her coach, by the end of the week, she noticed she ran a little bit flat, but she also trained throughout that week. So, it's kind of like saying, like, let's go race the car on the weekend. We'll fill it up on Saturday, but then throughout the week, we'll train the shit out of that car and take it to the weekend with half a tank of fuel. You may as well have just, arrived with half a tank of fuel instead of putting it in. So if you are going to front load, you more than likely will get the best possible results if you either don't train for the remainder of the week or you do very little training. You may even just rely upon posing to do that. I like it for that, right? For that primarily from a pro's perspective. The con is that you can potentially run a little flat, like you mentioned, George, with Ethan, in that some people will just burn through more fuel, and they also like the benefit of like putting carbohydrates in is that you also pull fluid, and that pulling fluid will give you intramuscular fullness, and that fullness will dissipate as you then become a little bit more dehydrated towards the back end of the two. So if you're going to push diuresis or fluid loss at the back end to try and get like the driest possible look, as iravity is that, then you may run into that flatness aspect.
Yeah, so moving back into the backload again, it's kind of the similar conversation. We're literally just flipping it on its head and looking at the pros and cons from a slightly different angle. The risk or the con to the backload is criteria specific. If you're a classic athlete you're going to have to do a backload if you're close to the top of your weight cap, so you're going to have to do that approach anyway. The risk there is that one, digestive space, like Dean mentioned earlier, can be taken up, which may hinder your look, especially if in classic is a heavily big judged thing. Or that, say, in other categories like bodybuilding and men's physique, doing a backload, you may run the risk of increasing the carbohydrate load, pulling in more fluid, and that not just sitting intracellularly, because it will pass through fascia tissue and space quite fluidly, it will sit in the extracellular as well. So if you don't have a good gauge of where that look should land, again, like Dean caveat back to earlier, saying about having the refeed data to actually plan a backload, unless you don't know how that look's going to land, you're probably taking a bit of a risk with it. And the benefit is that you obviously will land as full as you potentially could be in that scenario. It also does offer up an opportunity to, if you're chasing your tail, catch up on some time. So if you're doing you could run a fat loading approach and still leverage yourself into a slight deficit, keep some minor lipolytics in, try and run the individual down if you're chasing your tail for like a first show perhaps. So it does offer that kind of ability to continue prepping into the load up at the end. I wouldn't advise doing that, and it's the last resort, but it does offer you that.
Okay, cool.
That is actually
undulating pros and cons.
One con to the front load too is that it could fuck around with your weight if you're going to need to make weight. Because you know, that is one thing where you just don't have the opportunity to then get weight back down for whatever reason. Like you hope that it will come back down, but maybe it goes too high, and then you've got to do some things then that aren't going to be suitable, like glycogen depletion based training, fluid loss.
Saunas.
You just completely ruined everything you did, but to make weight. So there is a disadvantage to that as well.
Yeah, I think we need to write a post on how to choose which one, because that is really interesting. Like what your category is if you're trying to make weight, like all that stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
It shows you why our brains hurt at this time of year.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is why I'm sitting like this for this whole podcast with my hands on my temples. Like,
This is why I'm 20, not even 27 yet, and I look 40.
I don't envy you guys. Living with a prep coach, I know the stress that it demands on everyone because there's so many things to consider. And then when you layer on top that you're not working just with complicated machines, you're working with emotional humans who have like fears and desires and personalities. There's a lot.
Isn't desire. That is true.
The undulating load, to pull it back to the last final one before I'm just explaining this is one that I know Dean will have a lot more experience with, because it's one that you have to apply to an individual that you know more or less like the back of your hand. You have to be able to look at this individual and have seen them in that many repeated states to know when they are truly flat, when they are truly full, when they're holding body fat, like all the ins and outs. So trying to attempt the con of the undulated load is that it takes a very good eye, and how can you quantify what the individual's actually looking at specifically to say like this is a data perspective. So it's hard. You can see weight movement, but you need to have the eye on the individual and repeated past looks to perhaps refer back to be like, oh, okay, this is where he's a little bit flat. I can top him up tomorrow and have a game plan running in. But that doesn't work with new clients. You have to have a long experience and relationship with that person.
And I would also probably say that the client needs, oh, sorry, go George.
The pro is that you can, if you get it right, land the best look.
Yep. Yeah. I wonder if you're about to touch on this then, Liz, because it is a huge one for undulating. And that is, you need a client who is able to essentially manipulate somewhat their food and cook their food and be ready to do things on the fly. So it's a very, it's time demanding, both for the coach, but also for the client, because it's very much a, hey, I'm going to see what you look like tomorrow, and they're going to have we're going to decide what to do. 9 times out of 10, there's going to be a plan that's in play, but sometimes that shit goes south. You give them a certain amount of carbohydrates, you expect a certain look, you expect a certain weight, they wake up heavy, and you go, oh, hang on a minute. Okay, I'm going to now, that diet that you're going to do today is now no longer that diet. This diet is going to be this diet, Obviously, you can somewhat like fail proof your system by keeping everything pretty controlled and only changing carbohydrates and foods that don't mess with the electrolyte balance and all that kind of stuff. But again, that takes a very trained eye. It takes a very smart approach. I think that if you're a fairly predictable individual, in that when you eat more food, you either gain weight or lose weight or stay neutral pretty consistently, or you don't have a lot of fluid fluctuations and all these sorts of things, that usually front loads and back loads will do the job 9 times out of 10 for most people. I think for individuals that are quite undulating in their response to their stress and then also to their food, are also probably very well suited to an undulating approach. And almost always as well, I would say, very large individuals, because the effect on the look that food has and stress has is it swings massively. We mentioned Mike Lucy before, like we're talking about a 130 kilo individual who, if I pull out too many calories for 3 days, he loses 5 kilos, but he doesn't get that 5 kilos back in 3 days of refeeding. It takes a week and a half. So like for individuals like this that undulate in their weight and their look, you also need to typically undulate their nutrition accordingly.
Yeah, good points. No, what I was going to say is that for clients that are quite anxious and they want to know what they're going to do in advance, that there was 2 things I was going to say. This was the first one. That's like structure might be too stressful because the coach is deciding day to day what the carbs are going to be, and they won't know, and that might just create like unnecessary anxieties. But the second thing I was going to say is it's the coach is making decisions on the fly based on the look, and unless the client is standing in exactly the same room under the exact same lighting, and even if the coach is there, like the camera angle might be at a slightly different angle, it can dramatically change how the person looks, even if they look exactly the same as the day before. So the client also needs to be really spot on with the way they're taking photos, the time of day, like, yeah.
But even the bias of the coach's thoughts and the client's thoughts will have an effect here. You know, like,
Yeah.
oh, I fed them yesterday, they're going to look full. Or, you know, I pulled food a little bit and they woke up light and they're going to go, I'm flat. I'm like, well, hang on a minute. Like, you know, so like, that's the point. You have an individual, let's just say they're 103 kilos. You give them more carbohydrates, they wake up at 104 kilos. They say they're full, they feel great. Everything like aligns nicely. You then keep food neutral or pull it out, and then they lose weight. They wake up the next morning, they haven't trained. All they've done is just eaten food. And they're like, I'm flat now because I'm 103. Like, oh, hang on a minute. Like, if you lost a kilo of fuel, a kilo of weight, but you've not burned any energy, then you can't really be flat, but you can certainly feel flat because you've now associated weight loss with flatness. So there's a whole shit show of things. And the other thing too is like most people that we deal with have jobs, they have life, and undulating and changing food and all this every day is not really that easy to do.
Practical, yeah.
Unless you're going to take the week off, which, you know, we can't necessarily ask everyone to take a week off work in order to peak for an amateur.
Even pros, though, they still have jobs and lives and responsibilities to families and other obligations. So, yeah, what? I know, George.
How dare they? The
But, like,
audacity.
What do you mean professional bodybuilding doesn't pay a living wage?
Yeah, family. You're not allowed that. It's chicken and rice only. That's it.
Right? No family, no feelings, bodybuilding.
Nope.
That's it. All right. Well, thanks, boys. That was great. There's quite a few little branches we could go down on this, like some other variables like flats and fats. What's flats? Fats and fluids and sodium. And on the post that we put up on Instagram, just briefly discussing these three strategies, we had some awesome questions. So I don't know, maybe we'll do a part 2. We'll see, answering some of those questions, talking about the other variables. But for now, let's wrap it up with a something worth sharing. Dean, it can be absolutely anything. I believe you have something for us today.
His post on Instagram.
Yeah. That post does have some additional information around like why you might want to mix like a fruit-based carbohydrate with a starch-based carbohydrate, and a couple of things like that. For the most part, let's just tell everybody here too on these carb load strategies, if you just keep fats and protein neutral and sodium neutral, the carbs will do the job. There are things you can do to them, but if we were talking about a coach needing to be skilled and having like previous history with a client to do an undulating load, that's sure as shit you need that if you're also then going to manipulate sodium and fluid, because those are the things that will mess the look the most. So carbohydrates really won't mess the look that much, you know. So just manipulate the carbohydrates, keep everything else the fucking same. Super simple.
Yeah. Sorry, I just realized I forgot a segment before something worth sharing, and it's a be less shit tip. And I feel like that's a great one. How can people be less shit?
In peak week? Yeah. I would say twofold. Expect awesomeness, because if you expect it, it'll probably eventuate. Don't expect failure. And do that. Yeah. Keep protein neutral, keep sodium neutral, keep fluid neutral, keep fats neutral. Just play with the carbohydrates and see what happens.
And always remember, you can use 5 guys and a diazide if it all fails. Please do not do that. Anyone listening, that is a joke.
Or Photoshop.
Yeah. Yeah, there is that.
All right, Dean, something worth sharing.
For those that are interested in like maybe looking at like a variable undulating approach with all the ins and outs of sodium and fats and like other weird strategies, like maybe sleeping somewhat upside down in a bed, and I've just caught your ears, everybody. Is it called upside?
Is that a joke thing?
No, that's actually legit. Is it called upside down tilt? Is that it? I can't remember.
Fucked if I know.
Trying to shift fluid off the lower body.
Yeah. Basically, there's a research paper. It's called Peak Recommendations for Bodybuilders: An Evidence-Based Approach. It's by Dr. G Fit Guillermo. I don't want to pronounce his name incorrectly. And then Dr. Scott Stevenson and a couple of other co-authors, and they basically just pull all of the available research on peaking bodybuilders. And one of the ones is from Dr. Scott Stevenson. He's a legend. He's a wacky dude. He goes and finds anything you could possibly manipulate to look at make a physique look different. And one of them is this upside down tilt for people that are interested. It was founded, Liz, just quickly, in I think NASA research from memory, in astronauts who have blood flow issues. So they were trying to find out ways that they could manipulate their sleeping positions in order to sustain appropriate circulation to various parts of the body. And one of them is to basically make it so that your head is tilted in about like somewhere between 5 and 15 degrees, I think, in a downwards direction, so that your feet are above you. And basically it will help blood flow naturally go with gravity to the head, so that they weren't getting lightheaded and waking up and feeling off and all these sorts of things. And in doing so, you actually do see fluid shift out of the lower extremity too. So you can technically get some blocks and put them under your bed the night before you go to bed. And then the night before you go to bed, how do you do that? I mean, the night of you go to bed, but the night before you go to competition.
Just before you go to bed.
Yeah.
The night before competition.
And you don't want to get like a blood rush to your head, but just an ever so slight tilt. If you are susceptible to fluid retention in the ankles or in the legs, it might be a strategy to use. I have encouraged guys to use it if they've wanted to before, when they've had some fluid issues, especially coming off flights and stuff like that, if they've been pretty close to show. But yeah, it's a funny one.
Yeah, I usually do a similar.
The look on my face hasn't been wiped off yet, and I still think this is bizarre. Go on, George.
I was going to say I did a similar thing, but instead of sticking blocks under the bed, just get them to put some 2 big pillows under their feet and create like a leverage.
See, would that not work the same way? Somebody lays down on their back and then just, like bends at the hip and the knee and just kind of sleeps with their legs up a tabletop.
And also sleeping in like almost like a hook line position, like your back is level and then your legs are up, which if you can't sleep on your back is not really going to work that well, because you can't really do it side on. Your hips don't work the same way as it does when it inflection and extension, and it's only small. So like you should basically feel like you're sleeping normally, except it's just enough to just, let's use the word, promote fluid loss from the lower extremities.
Okay.
If you see competitors backstage with their legs up the wall vertically, it's not really helping. It's actually probably more of a hindrance.
They get up with numb hips and they can't eat a pose. Yeah, so yeah, that is it. It was when was it? 2021. I just double checked. 2021 paper. It's mad. I will say that it's content heavy, but it has some really cool like graphs and really cool like tables and stuff on how you set up carbohydrates. You'll see similar numbers to the ones we've spoken about here. And yeah, it's a great.
Is it an open access paper, Dean?
Not confirmed nor denied, unfortunately.
Can we share Sci-Hub, or is that a legal thing we can do? So what we'll do is I'll link the paper in the show notes, but a lot of papers are protected behind a paywall, unfortunately. But there is a website called, yes,
it is open access by looks of it, because I just searched for it on Google, and then first link went to BMC Sports Medical, and it's
wonderful. Okay, I will link it in the show notes. Well, I'll get our assistant to. Okay, great. So I'm going to ask you guys, would you rather? Knowing how challenging undulating carb loads are, would you rather never be able to manipulate carbs in a peak week? They just stay flat like they were 2 weeks before a show, or only ever be able to do undulating carb loads in a peak week?
I mean, Halo and sodium could save them on the fat load. I'd probably go with the undulating load every time. Just pulling out the carbs, they just turn up stringy, unless they've got some mad bubbly genetics. It would just never look good. You'd be peeled all the time though, and dry.
Okay.
I would do the same, but for less of that reason and more of the fact that I know that there is not a single client out there that would be willing to accept a non-peak week and still get positive results. Okay. Despite the fact that I know that most people would still look pretty good on stage if they just did nothing. But I think doing nothing, most people would be unhappy with that, and then they would either do their own thing or they would stress the fuck out, and it would just get worse. So more from a psychological perspective, I'm going to say that. And I'll even say this:
Right.
I have in the past have had put myself in a position where somebody wanted to do particular things in peak weeks, and I would sell them on this idea of it being the magic dust, because I knew that they thought peak weeks mattered so much when I really didn't do much at all. But the perception was that it was a huge change.
And so why is that important, Dean, that you play to their perceptions?
Because it helps mediate that stress response that we've kind of alluded to a couple of times here, in that they're either going to stress the fuck out and then become a ball of fluid and just look terrible, or they're going to stress and burn through fuel, or they're going to do some silly things, you know. And then even just the perception of getting up on stage and being proud of what you put up there, then presentation changes. Like, you know, I really cannot talk enough to the mental or psychological buy-in to a peak week being about exactly what it is, which is like a refinement process, and people just being excited just to get up there and really show what they've done, having a massive impact on the look. It's huge. So, yeah.
Okay. So it sort of like helps feed their confidence, which then changes the look and their presentation.
Yeah. But even little things like, and this is a risky business job to do, but like I'll take punts a lot of the time on my guys on the expectation of what will happen to a look. Like I'll tell them what's going to happen. Hey man, I'm giving you this today. This is what will happen tomorrow. Because when it hits, they're like, yeah, we're good. Like every time, you know. I said this to Mitch last night. I'm like, hey dude, we're going to load harder tonight than we did last time, but I guarantee you'll be light tonight. I just know you'll be light. And lo and behold, he went to bed lighter than he did the day before. But that's only because I know Mitch. So Mitch and I have worked together for 3 years. So I know what happens when I do certain things with him, you know, like it's like, and he's like, fuck man, again, you know.
So it builds the confidence in his coach.
And then then it's the next day, it's like, what are we doing, coach? This, all right, bro, I'm in. And then there's no longer this question of like, oh, what's going to happen? It's just like, oh, this is going to be fun. And you just start to build this momentum of enjoyment, which goes a long way in the look.
Yeah, love it. Well, thanks, boys, for sharing your brains with us. Thank you, listeners, for coming along for the ride. Please give us a 5-star review, like, share with your friends, tag us on social media, flex_success, and we'll see you in the next step.
Peace.
Peace.